Okay, so this video is a review of surface currents, large-scale surface currents in the oceans for you guys. And the first slide that I have up here is just a map of the major ocean gyres. And I'm not going to go into this right now, but let's get started with what drives the surface currents. And so I'm going to make some assumptions that you remember some of the things that we've talked about and just talk about the major concepts. But the equator, right here, the equator tends to be much hotter than higher latitudes. And that means that the air above the equator is much hotter and hot air rises. So at the equator, hot air is rising. And that happens all day, every day, because there aren't a lot of variation in seasons at the equator either. So that hot air rises, and I want you to think back to our fish tank demonstration that we did in class. And we looked at this diagram, and what you saw is in our fish tank, hot water rose till it hit the surface of the water. And in this case, we're talking about air, and hot air rises until it hits the surface of the atmosphere. And it also is starting to cool. So it hits the surface of the atmosphere, and it actually starts cooling and sinking back down to the surface of the Earth, where it gets heated, and then eventually rises again. So this is just like the hot and cold water that we looked at in the fish tank, and that's exactly what's happening on the surface of the planet. This hot air is rising, but it hits the top of the atmosphere and is deflected both north and south. Then that deflected air is cooling because it's not receiving the same heating, so it's sinking. And I'm going to focus on the northern hemisphere from this point forward. So it's sinking, and it eventually drops back to the surface of the planet at approximately 30 degrees. And once it hits the surface of the planet, it's deflected again because the air can't sink through the ground. So it's deflected north and south at approximately 30 degrees. And so what you can see is that we've created already one cell here with circulation happening in this big cycle from 0 to 30 degrees. Now, the air at 30 degrees is flowing both north and south, as we talked about, and the air that's flowing north actually meets air that is sinking from the pole. So this is the coldest air on the planet, and it's sinking down from the North Pole to southern latitudes because it's dropping here. So these masses of cooler air meet at approximately 60 degrees and are forced upwards. So this upwards flow is not due to heating. It's not hot air rising. It's just that when two air masses meet, they have to go somewhere, and they can't go down because the Earth is beneath them, so they go up. And then they hit the top of the atmosphere and are deflected again, north and south. So we create another cell here rotating in this direction, and a cell here rotating in this direction. Okay, so those are large-scale circulation patterns happening in our atmosphere at sort of predictable intervals of latitude. This is what drives surface winds. And so if we look at the way the wind is blowing along the surface of the planet, I'll use black for this because of my black cells. So if we look first at the wind in the most northern latitudes, we see that the air is flowing along the surface of the Earth from north to south, right? And that's actually a little confusing the way I drew that. So I'm just going to say it's flowing down from the North Pole south because the cold air is sinking down to lower latitudes. If we look at from 30 to 60, right here you see that it's flowing from south to north. And so I'm going to draw my arrow like this. And then similarly in the tropical latitudes, the air is flowing down from 30 degrees towards the equator, so it's flowing from north to south. But as we discussed in class, the Coriolis effect deflects objects in motion. So objects in motion in the northern hemisphere have an apparent deflection to the right. I'm not going to explain Coriolis again here. I'll produce a separate little tutorial for that, and we've talked a lot about it in class. But we're just going to recognize that in the northern hemisphere, objects are deflected to the right. So if we go back to our understanding of surface winds, I'm just going to quickly put in the atmospheric circulation that we just talked about all in one color. So it's rising here, sinking here, creating a flow from north to south. In this cell, the sinking air hits rising air here and creates a cell here, so the wind blows from south to north. And in the most polar latitudes, the circulation is in this direction, so that the wind is blowing this way. But Coriolis acts upon these bodies of air moving, and all of these bodies of air are actually deflected slightly to the right of their intended path. So up here, the wind actually ends up blowing to the right of path, which actually means a little bit more to the west. In this direction, they're actually deflected, the wind is deflected to the right this way. So it's flowing a little bit more from the southwest to the northeast. And then in the tropical latitudes, the deflection is this way. So we end up with the trade winds, the polar easterlies, and these are the westerlies. And recall that winds are named by their source, so the direction that they flow from. Okay, so those are our surface winds. Now we can actually finally start talking about surface currents. So before I draw surface currents on this map, I'm just going to locate our major lines of latitude to orient you. So here's the equator. I'm highlighting it in yellow. And here is 30 degrees north. And 60 degrees, I think, runs right around here. And then we have 90 at the pole, 90 degrees north. Okay. Again, I'm just focusing on the northern hemisphere, but the same rules apply in the southern hemisphere. So I'll now add our winds in this lovely purple color. So the westerlies are the ones I just finished with. So the westerlies are blowing here in this general direction. The trades are blowing in the opposite direction in the tropics. And I'm actually going to draw the trades down in the southern hemisphere because it will help with this discussion a little bit. And then the polar easterlies are blowing this way. They're not super relevant to discussing the North Pacific gyre. But so we've explained our surface winds that are the result of uneven heating of the Earth and the Coriolis effect. And now let's look at the flow of water. And let's do water in red so it shows up clearly on this map. But if we start at the equator here in the eastern Pacific, so I'm starting where I'm circling on the map, this water is getting blown from the east to the west, right? Because the trades are moving here. So the friction of that wind moving against the water is pushing the water from the east to the west. And it actually pushes the water along the equator. But it can't just flow forever along the equator because we're hitting Papua New Guinea and the Philippines and Palau and this whole archipelago over here. So what actually happens is the water piles up a little bit but is deflected to the north and the south. Now we're just going to focus on the northern hemisphere. As soon as it's not moving along a single line of latitude, the Coriolis is going to start acting upon this body of water, much like it acted upon the wind. And in the northern hemisphere, we know that objects in motion are deflected to the right of their intended path. And so this is actually going to end up being deflected more and more right as this body of water moves. In addition, there's some more continent that's going to provide some obstacles. And then as soon as we cross this 30-degree north latitude line, the westerlies are actually now pushing this body of water in the opposite direction. So the westerlies are flowing here, Coriolis is acting on this body of water, and the body of water is now sort of moving to the right. And up here, the Coriolis deflection is so strong and the wind such that it's flowing in the exact opposite direction from the equator. It's now flowing from the west to the east. But again, it hits a continent and is deflected primarily south. There's this little eddy up here that we're not going to talk too much about, but the vast majority of the water is deflected along our coastline. And again, Coriolis acts on it, and it is deflected more to the right because of the Coriolis effect. So what we end up with is, I need a new color. Let's do this orange here. What we end up with is this big clockwise gyre in the northern Pacific. The exact same explanation holds true for the North Atlantic. And if we do the same exercise in the southern hemisphere, we see that the gyres flow in a counterclockwise direction for the same reason, and because Coriolis deflects to the left in the southern hemisphere. So we have clockwise gyres in the northern hemisphere due to surface winds and the Coriolis, and counterclockwise in the southern hemisphere.